Bienvenidos to Open. I'm your host, Cristina Pagan. Peace journalism is when editors and reporters make choices that improve the prospects for peace. Here to tell us a little more about what peace journalism means and how it can be applied daily is the director of Center for Global Peace Journalism at Park University, Professor Steve Youngblood. Welcome.
It's my pleasure.
Hi. So, you made a little face when I was giving that description based on what I was given. So can you tell us what peace journalism actually means?
Did I? It was an inadvertent face. Your description was just fine. So you mentioned making choices, and that's really what peace journalism is about. So traditional journalism makes a choice all too often to be sensationalistic, to be exploitative, to pit one group against another group. And even in extreme cases, traditional journalism in many countries has incited violence. And I can cite many, many examples of that, starting back with the Rwandan genocide. You know that media, radio played a large role in that. Well, peace journalism obviously would be the opposite of this, would be that it's journalism where editors, reporters, journalists are aware of the consequences of their reporting. So if we report this story in this way, what are the consequences? So peace journalism doesn't suggest that we would ignore something violent that happens, but what we would say is, how can we report it in a way that it doesn't make a bad situation even worse? That it doesn't, to use an analogy I always use, pour gasoline on the fire. So we're very concerned with how we frame stories. We're very concerned with the language that we use, because language, of course, can be very powerful and can be very incendiary.
Right. I mean, just in terms of some of the things that have been happening over the past few years, in terms of Syria, what's happened in Russia, I'm sure that those are definitely times where we have to take a look at how do we frame this in a way that won't put a bias on either side, but at least give the story as it is without making it worse.
Exactly. And, in terms of decisions that countries make about going to war or not, the classic example in this country, of course, is the Iraq War. So 10 years ago, and this isn't just me talking, but many media critics and many media outlets themselves would tell you that they didn't do a very good job in the run-up to the Iraq War, that they simply parroted Bush administration propaganda about weapons of mass destruction and so on. And the result was a war that cost us $3 trillion, thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. What if the press had been more critical in their approach to the administration 10 years ago? I don't know that there wouldn't have still been a war, but I will say that I think it's the press's responsibility to present all of those perspectives. And that's just not good peace journalism, it's good journalism, period.
Can you give us an example of maybe a prominent journalist that you think is doing a particularly good or bad job in that aspect?
Well, if you want a bad job, just tune into the Fox News network. But I will say on the other side, MSNBC just as bad. So whenever you're getting only one perspective, when the news is slanted, when the news is designed to pit one group against another, I think that has a detrimental effect. And the effect that you see can be seen in some survey data that was released by the Pew Institute just about 2 weeks ago, talking about how polarized Americans really are. So 20 years ago, they have a chart that shows 20 years ago, there was a center, a middle in American politics, but that now we've drifted to either end, very conservative or very liberal. And I think that the media have a responsibility, take some of the responsibility for that fact. In terms of a journalist I really like, I'm a pretty big Nicholas Kristof fan. And I think that a lot of what he does is not only smart, but it's designed to put a different perspective on things. So his reporting about Africa, for example, isn't the same old tired narrative about war and famine and so on, but it seeks to expand it and give a more three-dimensional view of people and events in places like Africa, in places like the Middle East.
What about, I know they've taken surveys, and I know people of a certain age get a lot of their news from the fake news, from The Daily Show, Colbert, and even now I've been watching Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. And they're reporting, they obviously they have their own biases, and you can see that, and they're trying to counteract the Fox News that you're talking about. But they also give a perspective that I don't see even in regular journalism, and they do give this whole other aspect and dynamic. How do they fit into this journalism?
What's interesting that you mentioned that. I'm a big fan of both The Daily Show and Colbert, and I've seen John Oliver a couple times and think it's pretty good. So not too long ago, and this may have been Pew as well, but they did a study of to see how informed people were. So it was a giant current events quiz, and then so they got the results of the current events quiz, and then they asked the people, where do you get your news from? Mm-hmm. And those who scored the highest on the current events quiz, or among the highest, were viewers of Colbert, The Daily Show, and so on. Mm-hmm. So even though they may have a slanted view, they're getting a lot of news. There's a lot of substantive news value in there, which I think is interesting. You also probably wouldn't be surprised to learn that the least informed, the people who scored the poorest on the news quiz, were Fox News viewers. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, Fox News viewers scored worse than those who admitted to consuming no news at all. So it's literally worse. You're literally less informed watching Fox News than you are watching any news.
They should change the
slogan. So I thought that was very fascinating.
That is pretty fascinating. But how do you change that? How do we create an environment in journalism where everyone is giving the correct news, or the not maybe known as correct news? Everyone has their own bias, but how do we push toward having everyone in peace journalism doing that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, certainly it's an uphill battle, isn't it? Because Fox has made millions of dollars doing what they do. Mm-hmm. MSNBC has made millions of dollars doing what they do. So there's a tired notion, I think it's a tired notion, in journalism circles that only sensationalism sells, that you have to be hyper-opinionated to get people to pay attention to what you're doing. And that's a notion that I completely disagree with. I think that good storytelling sells, and that you can, like Nicholas Kristof, like occasionally Anderson Cooper, although he's in and out, but occasionally you'll see some of this good reporting on CNN as well, that these kinds of good stories that follow the peace journalism outline, peace journalism guidelines, are compelling and can be compelling. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what we're doing here this week at BronxNet, is working with young people in how to tell a compelling story using some of these peace journalism ideas, how to give a voice to the voiceless.
Mm-hmm. And with your interaction with the students, how has that been so far in these workshops?
Terrific. They're very interested. They're curious. They'll challenge me when they think I'm wrong, which is frequently, but that's good. Right. So it's been a great experience, and this is my third time in the Bronx, so third time at BronxNet, and so I wouldn't keep coming back if I didn't think it benefited the students and BronxNet, and certainly I enjoy it as well.
Thank you so much for joining us. We have to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Bye.